Chapter 6, Just One Man and One Woman. Bastard, how dare you do that to your stepdaughter? You deserve to die for this! Exclaimed Lord Melbourne indignantly, wanting to jump on the man and kill him. Lord Melbourne, do you want me to send for the police? Asked Mr. Penge, making the fear would be reflected in Victoria's stepfather's face. Lord Melbourne, said Francatelli, almost whispering to Lord Melbourne, pardon me for my daring, but if you really cares about young lady, if you sincerely care about her, it may not be a good idea to involve the police. The scandal would inevitably come to the press, because you are a former Prime Minister, and your image would be affected, and the girl's reputation could be publicly questioned. Lord Melbourne saw Victoria cry compulsively on Eliza Scarrett's chest, who caressed her trying to calm her down. You're right, Lord Melbourne said, almost whispering to Francatelli, but that bastard cannot leave here like he would have done nothing. I'm afraid he'll try to do something against her again. I understand, Lord Melbourne, but if you allow me, I know how to deal with scum like this. Unfortunately, I've had to live with many scoundrels equal or worse than this one. If you leave the matter in my hands, you assured him that bastard will never again bother Miss Victoria and that he will never come back here, said Francatelli honestly and reassuringly. Agreed, I trust you, but you will make it clear that he will die if he touches her again, replied Lord Melbourne. Of course, my lord, said Francatelli. Francatelli approached John and grabbed him by the arm while Penge took him by the other arm. They carried him roughly, followed by other servants. Eliza put Victoria against the wall without ceasing to embrace her, to cover it with its body and to prevent that John happened next to her while they took it to him. Eliza looked at him angrily. Dirty bastard! Eliza said, unable to contain her anger. Shut up, bitch! John replied defiantly, but Francatelli gave him a strong tug of the arm that made him stagger and almost fell to the ground. When they finally got John out of the building, Francatelli grabbed him with rage from the neck and pushed him against the wall, cornering him, and he saw him with a menacing look. Listen to me, piece of shit. I know those of your kind very well, because I've had to deal with many disgusting cowards like you in the streets. That's why I'm going to tell you this once, and for your sake, you'd better take it seriously. I have many friends in the worst neighborhoods in London, friends who can be very dangerous, and a few of them owe me favors, and in any case they are willing to do anything I ask them to do. If you go back to approach Miss Victoria, or anyone else in this house, especially the women in this house, if I know you've been even a mile away from Victoria, Lord Melbourne, or anyone living or work in this house, I'll make sure my friends draw you with a razor. A second smile on the neck. After all, you'll be another disgusting gangsman or beggar who dawns dead in the streets of London, and the police will not even bother to investigate. And the witch you have as a wife will have to go and take you flowers to the cemetery, if you does not end in a mass grave, said Francatelli, speaking in a menacing tone that left no doubt as to the sincerity of his threat, as he pressed his arm against John's neck, barely leaving him space to breathe. He's threatening me with death. He's threatened me with death and your witnesses, John said to Penge and the other servants. I have not heard anything. Unfortunately, I am quite deaf and often do not know what they say around, and I think it is an epidemic in this house, because I think the others have not heard anything either, Penge replied mockingly and sarcastically. The other servants also said with mocking laughter that they had heard nothing. And if the words of Mr. Francatelli were not enough to dissuade you, I would like to add that I have a shotgun that from now on I think I will have loaded and not very far from me at all moment, and if I see again your dirty face of cowardly rascal poking out for this house, I intend to use it. After all, the law gives me the right to kill an undesirable intruder who sneaks into the house where I live and work, and threatens the life of my employer or anyone living in it. And I can boast of good marksmanship, said Penge in a menacing tone as he took a few steps towards John, who was still cornered against the wall by Francatelli. All of you are cowards. You are several against one man, exclaimed John, indignant and cowed. A man, you? Do not make me laugh. As for what you say, it seems that in a fight against a single man you does not do very well either, judging by how you stayed after the fight with Lord Melbourne. And that was just an aristocrat accustomed not to fight with punches, and surely you boast of being very macho, like all those of your breed. But you're lucky it was Lord Melbourne, because if it would have been me and you would have dared to put your dirty hands on my woman, I swear to you that now you would be dead. But with trash like you, fair fights are not worth, just let it be clear to you, what I said to you. You understood, damn bastard. Francatelli told him as he pulled a pocket razor out of his pocket and displayed it in front of John's face in a menacing gesture. It's okay. You will not see me again, I swear. I will not approach Victoria or anyone in this damn house. Exclaimed John, cowed. That's the way I like it. Replied Francatelli, releasing the man and away from him. You escort the gentleman to the doors of the property and that he leave. Penge ordered the other servants, who approached John and pushed him to walk in front of them. After the other servants took John, Penge turned to see Francatelli. Well done, Mr. Francatelli. What I wanted to know is how that scum came into this property and came to the mansion. I'll have to find out who let him in. Penge said seriously. Mr. Penge. I'm sorry, Brody said nervously. I cannot believe it. You're an idiot. Cried Penge, advancing toward him. Forgive me, Mr. Penge, he told me that. Brody was frightened. But Mr. Penge began to scream furiously, and Brody shrank like a cowering puppy, while Francatelli shook his head and left, leaving the two alone. Meanwhile Eliza Scarrett took Victoria to Victoria's bedroom to reassure her and console her, although she found it difficult enough, for Victoria was in the midst of a nervous breakdown, although an infusion prepared by Francatelli was helpful. At the same time, Lord Melbourne went to his library, where Mrs. Lazen was dedicated to cure him of wounds he suffered in the fight, a situation which for Lord Melbourne was disconcerting and embarrassing at the same time, having met her, and feared, as the Baroness Lazen in the other reality. You are lucky, that I have served as a nurse in a field hospital during the Napoleonic Wars, Lord Melbourne. For me this is somewhat minor compared to amputations after a battle, but, finally, if you wish you can call your doctor, said Mrs. Lazen, cordially. No need, Mrs. Lazen, I'm more than satisfied with your attention, and after all, they're only small wounds, Lord Melbourne replied kindly, though Mrs. Lazen was a bit brusque in curing his wounds. Lord Melbourne's discomfort was a bit greater, for in front of him and behind Mrs. Lazen was Connor leaning against the desk and with a mocking smile, although as normal only he could see him. When Mrs. Lazen finished curing him and got up to leave, Lord Melbourne asked her to wait. Mrs. Lazen, I want to ask you not to rebuke Victoria. She's not to blame for what happened here today, the poor girl is a victim of her circumstances and that miserable criminal she has as her stepfather. Besides, the poor woman must now be very tormented, and I do not want to cause her any more suffering, on the contrary, I want to be informed if she continues with that nervous attack, to send for the doctor. When she calms down I want to talk to her. And thank you for all Mrs. Lazen, honestly, said Lord Melbourne worried and sad. You're welcome, Lord Melbourne. At his service, Mrs. Lazen replied helpfully, and after a little reverence she withdrew. I must admit I'm impressed, William. I never imagined you could fight so well. I'm proud of you. You're not exactly Muhammad Ali or George Foreman. Connor said half seriously, and half jokingly. Who? Asked Lord Melbourne bewildered. Forget this. The point is that you did very well, better than others that I have helped in previous missions. I remember that, on one occasion, another guy that I took to another reality ended up in an alley with two big and strong guys, A&D. Well, that did not end so well. But in your case it worked out, which is what matters, Connor said. Did you know that bastard was going to attack Victoria? Lord Melbourne asked with a hard expression on his face. The answer to that question is a bit complicated, although you do not believe it, my clairvoyance skills are limited, when it comes to an alternative reality forged by my intervention, but it is true that I can predict different probable scenarios, and as the event approaches, I have a clearer picture of what will happen. But you do not be angry with me, I assure you that if Victoria had been in a more serious and imminent danger I would have warned you in greater anticipation. And even if you cannot understand it now, sometimes a little suffering is necessary for a greater good. But thanks to your intervention she is safe, and that bastard has left the life of Victoria, that is certain, answered Connor reassuring. Well, while he stay away from her, Lord Melbourne replied, relaxing and leaning back in the armchair as he took a swig of whiskey. But what I said is serious. You have a good right hook and good kicks. It cannot deny that since I've been in your life, this one has become more interesting, said Connor in a jocular and mocking tone. Lord Melbourne saw him for a moment, then gritted his jaw into a smile and finally laughed, and Connor laughed too. Laughter served as an escape valve for his tension and relaxed him somewhat, though deep down he still worried about Victoria. A long time later Lord Melbourne was alone in the library, after Connor had left, as he always did, distracting him and moving out of his field of vision, to suddenly no longer be, as if he had vanished in the air, and he left leaving him talking alone. Lord Melbourne was with his eyes closed, his head lying back, still holding in a hand a glass of almost empty whiskey, and in the small table beside him was a bottle containing less than half its contents, although when he started drinking after the fight with John, it was almost full. He thought about what had happened and wondered with regret if they two ever really could be happy together. At that he heard knocks on the door and listened to Mrs. Lazen wanted to speak with him. He told her she could come in, though he did not really want to talk to anyone. Lord Melbourne, forgive me for disturbing you, but Miss Victoria insists on talking to you, and there is no way she gives up. But if you do not want, said Mrs. Lazen, uncomfortable by the strange relationship that existed between her employer and that young woman. Let her in. I'll talk to her immediately, Lord Melbourne said anxiously and with some anguish, jumping to his feet. Lord Melbourne dressed as he used to do when he did not expect visitors in home, as he wore the day Queen Victoria went to visit him at Dover House, in the other reality. Although in the new reality it did not matter to him that Victoria saw often with that appearance, because it was the habitual thing when dealing with its maidservant, and also because that way was made to the idea that already they were married. However, on this occasion he was almost as nervous as was that occasion, and he adjusted his clothes a little, although it was absurd because it was still dirty and stained with blood from the fight. Lazen retreated, then entered Victoria, while behind her Lazen closed the library door, supposing they both wanted to have a private conversation, despite the prejudices she might feel about it. Lord Melbourne was a little surprised to see her, for Victoria wore a bathrobe, knotted at the waist, and beneath it she had only her nightdress. Her hair was loose and looked wet, as if she had just bathed. She was wearing simple slippers that are used to walk comfortably at home. It was the first time in that reality or any other reality, when Lord Melbourne saw her as if she were about to lie down or just got out of bed, like she walked in the privacy of her bedroom, and he could not help feeling something excited, and with dissimulation placed his hands down to try to cover some unwelcome bulge in his lightweight pants. "Are you all right, Lord Melbourne?" Victoria asked, her voice broken with worry and anguish, coming forward a few steps and making a gesture, raise a hand, as if she wanted to touch his face and check with her fingers the ugly wound that the man had over his right eye, and that the swelling had partially closed his eye, but she restrained herself and stopped her hand in the air. "I'm fine, but you? How are you?" said Lord Melbourne, distressed, advancing as if he wanted to touch her, but he did not dare. "Me? I'm fine, Lord Melbourne," Victoria replied, ashamed, as if she was not worthy of him worrying about her. "But you? You're hurt," Victoria said with a hard effort to contain the crying. This is nothing. When I was a young student, I had worse fights. In fact, it reminded me of my best times," Lord Melbourne replied, trying to sound reassuring, trying to dismiss the matter, with a charming smile, causing Victoria let out a little nervous giggle. But it was my fault. It was hurt you because of me, and I cannot forgive myself for that, Victoria said, unable to contain her tears. It is not true. Nothing of what happened is your fault, Lord Melbourne said earnestly and worriedly about her, wanting to touch her, to embrace her, but not daring to do so. Lord Melbourne, you're hurt because you had to defend me, and I thank you with all my heart. But you should never have been exposed to that situation, and that is my fault. The only thing I can do to repair the damage done is to offer my resignation. Victoria said, weeping bitterly and pouting. No. I forbid you to say it. Lord Melbourne exclaimed, almost in a shout, in an emotional outburst that frightened Victoria a little, making him back a few steps. You cannot leave this house. I will not allow it. Lizzie needs you, she's very fond of you, besides, you've become an indispensable part of this house. Everyone in this house needs you. I need you. Victoria's eyes widened in surprise, her beautiful blue eyes filled with tears, and her face turned red. But Lord Melbourne. She tried to answer. Do not say anything. If it is to insist on your resignation, I am not ready to hear you. This is your home now, Victoria, and you will not leave. I simply cannot allow it, said Lord Melbourne, without even thinking how irrational he was saying, forbidding an employee to leave his house, as if he had rights about her. Victoria was still crying, but now she was not sure why. She did not know if she cried with shame, sadness, or joy at hearing that he needed her and was not willing to let her go. Thank you, Lord Melbourne. You are very noble. It was all she could say, trying to contain her sobs and clear her voice. Agree. But in the next few days I do not want you to leave Brocket Hall, for your safety, and when you do it again, I would rather you do it accompanied. For your welfare, said protective Lord Melbourne, with firmly. I agree, my lord. Victoria replied with a sweet smile, trembling with emotion at the feeling he cared for her. Lord Melbourne smiled sheepishly, then he lowered his gaze for a moment, and when he looked up again, he had a serious and tormented look on his face, a gesture that reflected a certain fear. He gestured with his jaw as if he were about to speak, but it seemed that he had difficulty saying what he wanted to say. Finally gathered the courage to speak. Victoria, there is something. I do not want to violate your privacy, and God knows I do not want to cause you any more pain or anguish, but I need to know. What happened today with your stepfather's bastard, is it the first time? Did he ever? Said Lord Melbourne with fear, afraid of her reaction, but especially afraid of her response. Victoria gestured with surprise and horror on her face, and then in an impulsive reaction she threw herself at Lord Melbourne, and with her hands clutched at Lord Melbourne's shirt on his breast. Weeping desperately and with pleading eyes, she saw him in the eyes. No. He never. My virtue is intact, I swear it for my life. You have to believe me. I could not bear you not believing me. Victoria exclaimed, almost hysterical. I think. But do not be like that. Though something had happened, it would not have been your fault, Victoria, Lord Melbourne replied affectionately stroking Victoria's hair. But it did not happen. I am chaste, Lord Melbourne. I cannot bear you to doubt it. Victoria said through sobs and pouting, not caring how inappropriate it was to talk about her intimacy as a woman with her employer, in her desperation to convince him that she retained her virginity. I believe you, I swear I believe you. But do not get like that, please. Lord Melbourne exclaimed, hugging her tightly, as she buried her face in his chest, feeling the heartbeat of Lord Melbourne. They both hugged each other, Lord Melbourne stroking Victoria's back with one of his strong hands as he held her with his other arm. Victoria, you have nothing to worry about. I know you better than you imagine, and that's why, you are the most important person in my life, said Lord Melbourne with emotion. Victoria froze, feeling as if her breath had stopped. Her body trembled and she slowly looked up to meet his eyes. "Lord Melbourne!" Victoria began, her lips trembling and her voice cracking. "I love you, Victoria. I love you," said Lord Melbourne, overcome with emotion. Victoria looked at him with her eyes wide and wet, tears streaming down her cheeks, and with a gesture that reflected the storm of emotions within her. Lord Melbourne stroked her cheek with the back of his hand and he brought his lips to hers. Victoria closed her eyes and advanced her face, offering her submissive lips. Lord Melbourne kissed her, slowly and sweetly, then with more passion, but trying to be delicate. She responded shyly, then with more enthusiasm, but with the clumsiness of an inexperienced girl. Lord Melbourne tasted the sweet taste of Victoria's mouth, which he thought tasted like strawberries, the most divine of sweets. She tasted the taste of Lord Melbourne's mouth, a bittersweet flavour, of liquor mixed with his saliva, but to her that alcoholic breath, seemed exciting and delicious. When they finally parted their lips, Victoria breathed with some difficulty, as if the kiss had not let her breathe and her heart was pounding by her nerves. Lord Melbourne saw her with love and desire, and with a certain tenderness at seeing the blush on her face. "I love you," Lord Melbourne repeated, feeling that his heart was at last relieving something painfully repressed for many years. "Please, Lord Melbourne. Do not say that," Victoria said, crying and her body trembling. "Why? My love is pure. I am not a dirty old man, I am in love with you sincerely, or perhaps you do not love me?" asked Lord Melbourne, frightened by her reply. "Lord Melbourne, do not force me to say out loud what you already know. You know it," Victoria said, pouting like a child. "I need to hear it," Lord Melbourne begged. "I love you. You are the person I love the most in the world," Victoria declared with utter conviction, sobbing. Lord Melbourne kissed her again, more passionately and holding her so tightly that he almost hurt her. But this time it was Victoria who broke the kiss, but not breaking the embrace, and saw him with a gesture of supplication and hurt puppy look. "But it cannot be, Lord Melbourne. This love would be our perdition," Victoria said with evident distress. "No." "Why?" replied Lord Melbourne distressed. "Why, I am inferior to you. You are a noble, rich and powerful, I am a maid," cried Victoria desperately. Lord Melbourne laughed bitterly at the irony of the situation, but Victoria misinterpreted it. "You laugh at me, Lord Melbourne? We have nothing more to talk about," cried Victoria, wounded in her feelings with pain and rage, and trying to leave. "No, wait," Lord Melbourne said, holding her by the arms, "I'm not laughing at you. It is only that I experienced this situation, but then I was the one who belonged to a lower social category," Lord Melbourne added pleadingly. "You? But that is impossible," Victoria replied, unable to avoid skepticism, for she could not imagine that there was someone of a social rank superior to Lord Melbourne whom he had fallen in love with, considering that he was one of the most important men from country. "She was from the royal family," exclaimed Lord Melbourne, almost in a cry of pain and despair. Victoria was left with her mouth open, really impressed. "And as much as I love you, I will never be able to tell you who it was. To say it would be treason to the crown. The mere fact of recognizing the existence of that attraction that did not even become a relationship, is already a betrayal on my part to that person and the crown," said Lord Melbourne with deep sadness and bitterness, as if the person he was talking about was not in his arms. Was it the person you told me about in the garden, that time?" Victoria asked with caution and sympathy as she saw the pain on Lord Melbourne's face, which she dared not see in her eyes. "Yes, she loved me and she wanted us to have a life together. But I rejected her out of loyalty to the crown and the country, but above all to protect her, so that she would not risk the future that corresponded to her birthright," replied Lord Melbourne, feeling suddenly very old, as if he had lived many lives over hundreds of years, unlike how he felt when he was kissing Victoria, when he felt like he was 20 years old again. "Then you understand what I feel," Lord M., Victoria said tenderly as she stroked his cheek, wiping away a tear that Lord Melbourne let slip, and feeling inside as she want to hold him and comfort his pain. You could not turn away from your duty and your principles for love, and I find myself in the same dilemma. And your principles dictate to you to condemn me to die of pain? To die slowly in the most bitter sadness and absolute loneliness, to whom you will condemn me if I do not have your love? Lord Melbourne replied, holding back the tears, and it seemed that he had repressed a small pout, with a comical movement of his jaw and his lips. That's not fair. I'd rather commit suicide than cause you such pain. Victoria protested bitterly, and the crying took hold of her again. Do not you understand that I'm making a great effort? I'm about to succumb, my strength falters, and if you keep insisting I'll give you my life, my soul, and my body, all that I am and what I will be. Then do not resist! Exclaimed Lord Melbourne eagerly, cradling Victoria's small face in his large, strong hands. Let me give you my love. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy, and to heal the wounds that others caused you, while you do the same for this old fool. By God, we are just one man and one woman. Just one man and one woman, who love each other, and who want to live life together. Oh, Lord Melbourne! Victoria exclaimed, torn by her internal conflict, God forgive me. I accept your love, Lord Melbourne. I accept to be your companion of life, even if it is my perdition. Lord Melbourne's face brightened with joy and he kissed her again passionately, while she responded with enthusiasm and awkwardness. Their bodies came together, expressing longing, desire, bad content. Lord Melbourne broke the kiss and saw her with happiness and gratitude. You have no idea how I waited for this moment, said Lord Melbourne, looking into her eyes, cradling her face again in his hands. Lord M., please. I just want you to promise me one thing, to guarantee me one thing. If we have children, swear to me, give me your word of honor that you will never leave them, that you will care of them while you live, and you will give them the opportunity to have a decent and prosperous life, much better than the one I had, said Victoria, very serious and excited. Of course. Why would I forsake my children, especially if they are yours too? Said Lord Melbourne, still happy, but amazed at Victoria's strange request, for he did not understand what she implied in her words. I am aware that the bastard children have no right to claim their father, Victoria began to say, determined to reaffirm her request, but embarrassed to admit that she renounced her honor, her reputation, for love. Bastard children! What are you talk? Victoria, do you think I'm such a scoundrel as to make you an indecent proposal? Lord Melbourne asked, hurt and angry, looking at Victoria with a reproachful look. Do you think I would steal your virtue to become you my concubine or mistress? You can believe that I would strip you of your honor knowing that you are chaste. But I do not understand. And if it's not that way, how are we going? Victoria replied, perplexed and very confused. Victoria, I do not want you to be my mistress, my concubine. I want you to marry me, Lord Melbourne said excitedly. What? Said Victoria, unable to believe what she had heard. Miss Victoria Edwards, would you marry me? Lord Melbourne asked anxiously, as he looked Victoria in the eyes intensely and pleadingly. Victoria stood petrified like a statue, feeling that her heart was going to burst so fast that it throbbed, her decomposed face by the barrage of emotions she had experienced on that intense day and by the huge final surprise, and believing that was living some kind of dream lived, because that could not be real.